I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Oregon, so kind of your run-of-the-mill psychotherapist. I work with individuals and couples on specifically sexual issues. So I'm a certified sex therapist through ASECT, which is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, which is a mouthful. But I'm a sex therapist. I've wanted to be a therapist for my whole life. Even from a very early age, I had really positive experiences with therapists and just kind of knew that that was sort of what I wanted to do eventually. I got, sidetracked into the world of tech sales for a long time, but eventually just kind of made my way back. And so became a therapist again, or not again, but I got back on the therapy track. And then with sex therapy, as I was going through grad school and trying to figure out what am I going to specialize in, that was when the Me Too movement was happening. And that brought up a lot of big feelings for me as a man, listening to some of the stories that I was hearing, really listening carefully to this movement, the words that were being shared, and just feeling a lot of internalized shame personally. And I realized as I was kind of listening to these stories just how much of that messaging was designed, I think, to create a sense of shame in men. Um, Obviously, extremely important movement, and it needed to happen. There's no question about that. I think that there was a piece of that messaging that was missing, which was not just, hey, men, here's what to stop doing. Great. But also, where was the message about here's how we can start to do better? And not really having access to that information, I had to dig for it. And the voices that I found often were voices of women. And I just knew that there needed to be more men talking about how to do better, how to operate from a place of consent, how to redefine masculinity. And that's why I wanted to get into sex therapy.
I think that's really powerful. And I think that it's really important. And you caught on to something that a lot of people missed. Part of the reason I asked you what drew you to this profession is that it is true. This field in general is filled with a lot of women
Mhm.
and female voices. And so I think it's important when there are masculine and male voices in this
Mm.
space. What would you say, in your experience as a therapist, if there is any repeated theme of a block to people really experiencing a fulfilling sex life or, yeah, a healthy sex life? Is there a repeated block or theme you see?
Yeah, shame. I mean, it comes down to shame. People have internalized so much messaging about what is okay to feel and not to feel, to think and not to think, who to have sex with and not to have sex with. It is we're all just, I think, drowning in the expectations of other people and frankly the agendas of people in power around sex and how we use our bodies. And so much of this process, actually, the book "Come as You Are" is fantastic. One of the analogies that she gives is that we're all sort of born with this plot of land, this sort of garden, and in that garden, I mean, it's full. It's full of plants. All of these little ideas and messages and traumas and expectations, you name it, that we didn't plant, we didn't choose, and it is our job, and it's our job as sexual beings to now sort through that garden, decide what it is that is serving us. What do we want to keep there? And what's a weed? What does not fit in the aesthetic of what we're trying to create? And that is a very painful and difficult process. And that's really what I see. And hopefully it's a joyful process too, I want to add. But that's what I see as really my job, is to help people go through that process of what do I want to keep? And if I want to add something new, what's available to me and how do I cultivate it? How do I take care of it?
Really interesting. You know, part of part of what we wanted to accomplish with these interviews is to
Mhm,
just give people factual information about their sexuality and also encourage people to explore themselves. So you gave that analogy of the garden, and
mhm,
I'm curious if you have found this to be true or not, but in my experience, interviewing so many therapists and researchers
mm,
and doctors and members and models, one of the things that I've realized is that so many people don't even know themselves sexually. Like we
mm.
know the type of foods we like to eat or activities we like to do, more or less,
Right.
but not many people have really been given the permission or the space to explore their sexual identities.
Mhm. I agree that people don't know themselves on average sexually, but I think we have to go even further back and to understand why that's the case. Why aren't parents talking to their children about sex? Why don't we use the word pleasure in sex education? This is, I mean, it's by design, right? We are, our systems of government, religion, are purposely shutting down the conversation around sex, um, to remove that power from people, and frankly to instill shame. I think that, yes, folks don't have an awareness of their own sexual needs, and I think that that is largely in part because what has been modeled, what has been reinforced, what has frankly been taken away are positive messages, open conversations. Um, we I think we're all inundated with slut shaming. I think that men are specifically taught not to talk about their feelings, and especially pleasure. Um, and that creates for this impossible situation where how are we supposed to figure out who we are as sexual beings? I mean, everything is working against us. You have to swim upstream against culture, against religion, against politics, often against our peers to figure out who we are sexually. Um, and I think it takes a lot of commitment, a lot of work, and a lot of, frankly, luck to be able to find that path. I think that sex positivity, what it means is that anything that takes place between consenting adults has the inherent capacity for good. So there is really, I mean, as the saying goes in the kink community, don't yuck my yum, right? Have you ever heard that? That there's nothing that you could tell me that you like that I would say, oh, that's bad about you. Literally nothing. Right? Now, I think that we all need to adopt just a baseline, a universal principle of consent, which I think is about human rights. And I think that we all need to embody that in the way that we approach sex with other people. But as it comes to who you are as a sexual being, there's nothing bad. There's literally nothing bad. There's nothing broken. There's nothing abnormal, even. And I think that that's such an important message too, is that most folks think that they are in some way not normal, and it's just not true. Everyone is. We are all very unique beings in who we are sexually. And anybody who tells you that who you are sexually is in some way bad or wrong or needs to change is they have an agenda. And I think that those messages need to be questioned and rejected.
What do you think is the purpose of controlling people's sexual identities?
Yeah, yeah. So bear with me for a moment because here's where I think it gets a little heady, but I've put a lot of thought and research into this. And I think this goes back, I want to trace this all the way back to the agricultural revolution. Okay. We went from being these nomadic pods of about 150 people. These are our genetic ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago. The same as you and I. We were these small communities who rarely, if ever, met each other, who were hunter gatherers. This is how we were. Shame is actually built into us as a survival mechanism for helping us to get along with a very limited set of people, about 150 people. Right? The only faces we had ever known our entire lives, this small group. And then the agricultural revolution happened. And people, as well as property, especially land became property. And when land became property, the people tending the land became property. And so we saw the rise of slavery. We saw the rise of kings. We saw essentially dictators, right? How do we control the means of production? One of which, sadly, is women's bodies, right? How do we control the folks tending the land so they are producing more people who are going to tend the land? So that we can have more people, so that we can have more land, for which we need more people. So in order to control that, in order to sustain growth, which we're seeing very much as part of our capitalist society today, we have to control the means of production. And in order to do that, you have to control women's bodies, which is why we have marriage in the form that we have it today, which is why we have, such, I think, strict views around monogamy, around what sex should look like, around birth control. And I think that is the cause of the war specifically on sex workers, because I think that they represent the opposite of that, the liberation of women, the liberation of women's bodies from the system of oppression designed to just generate more people.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad that you broke it down in that way. Yeah.
Thanks. It's about control. It's about controlling the masses. And here's where I want to read this quote, because I think it's really important. There was this researcher named Wilhelm Reich, a German researcher in the 1930s. He wrote this, and essentially he researched fascism, and he researched the psychology of fascism and how specifically it used sexual shame to control people, And here's what he said. He said, suppression of the natural sexuality in the child, particularly of its genital sexuality, makes the child apprehensive, shy, obedient, afraid of authority, good and adjusted in the authoritarian sense. It paralyzes the rebellious forces because any rebellion is laden with anxiety. It produces, by inhibiting sexual curiosity and sexual thinking in the child, a general inhibition of thinking and of critical faculties. In brief, and this is the last part, the goal of sexual suppression is that of producing an individual who is adjusted to the authoritarian order and who will submit to it in spite of all misery and degradation. Wow. This was written in 1938. And when the Nazis took power in Germany, this was one of the books that they burned. And I would submit it is because this messaging is spot on. I think we need to look beyond whether people are conservative, whether people are liberal. I think we need to look beyond whether they're religious. I think we need to look to the powers that be, the forces of propaganda that are manipulating our everyday lives, the messages that we've been fed, and importantly, the message that we haven't gotten, the power that's been taken away from us. And I think that we need to ask the question of what is the motivation? How am I being controlled? I believe firmly that expressing our sexual freedom, expressing our bodily autonomy, protecting it as if our lives depend on it, is a critical step in the fight against fascism. And I think that it's a fight that's happening very much right now, today.
That's really powerful. What would you say are basic first steps to really taking ownership of one's body and sexuality and pleasure?
Yes. Yeah. It's such a great question. I mean, first and foremost, learn about consent. Adopt consent. Adopt at a baseline of fundamental respect for the human rights of the people that we are sharing this world with. We need to learn to respect each other's bodies and respect our own bodies. And I think that starts with understanding the dimensions of consent. A really great resource for this is Planned Parenthood's FRIES model, which stands for freely given, revocable, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Learn these, be able to recite them, and practice them in everyday life. I think the other really powerful thing is communication. We have to start leaning into having some really difficult, not really difficult, but just awkward conversations around sex. I think we have to be willing to make some mistakes. I think we have to be willing to be vulnerable. I think we have to be willing to say words that don't feel great or make us cringe a little bit at first. I have this friend in town who runs this organization called Squirm. I highly recommend that anybody check that out, which is about leaning into awkward conversations around sex, because truly, unless we're willing to face that discomfort, we can't begin to dismantle the shame. It is a process of discomfort, and at times it's a painful process. But in order to really, I think, embody sex positivity, secure masculinity, I think it means consent and communication. I think the third thing that I'll say, just as a practical step, I think it's so wonderful that men out there are leaning into your platform to have conversations to seek emotional support. That's how I interpreted it. And I think it is important that therapy has value for a reason. I'm licensed, I'm trained for a reason. This process, I have a lot of respect for it, and I think that there are a lot of ways that therapy and the boundaries contained within therapy are really protective of the people that come to it. I think it's much more acceptable for the average man to go to a website like Live Jasmine and hire a sex worker or even just somebody to talk to. I think it's much less acceptable for the average man to go and say, "Well, I'm going to go get therapy now." But I think that can be a really powerful tool, A, to learn the consent, B, to learn the communication, but also just to do deep emotional work to better understand yourself, better accept yourself, and thus to better accept other people as well.
I'm just curious, what would you say as a therapist was something that you learned about human sexuality from seeing clients that surprised you? Something that did not come from school, came from being in the office with people.
Human sexuality, that surprised me. Esther Perel wrote this book called Mating in Captivity that essentially poses this idea that the modern marriage has become really inflated in terms of its expectations, where it used to be that it sort of took a village to meet our needs, right? Referencing back to that sort of nomadic tribe of no more than 150 people, that now we expect all of those things to come from one person. This person is my partner financially. Very often they're my therapist, they're my adventure buddy, they're my best friend, they're my confidant, they're my co-parent. I mean, you name it. This person is everything. Oh, and by the way, they're also my desire, my fantasy. They're everything that I need sexually. And it's an immense amount of pressure that's been put on one person as our expectations have gone through the roof. And I think, and as Esther Perel states as well, that very often it is destroying relationships that otherwise, with a more realistic set of expectations, could potentially thrive. And when I initially read this book, I thought, well, that's a pretty heady concept. I wonder how much this is true. And what I have found is that in my work, it has been almost universally true. That in some way, I think we are all feeling this pressure, not just the folks who have been married for a long time, but also the folks who are dating. And I would say even especially the folks who are in the process of dating. How do you find that one person who checks every single one of those boxes and within, a couple of months really make the determination like, oh yeah, I could spend the rest of my life with this person? It is a level of pressure that I think is eroding a lot of human relationships and is isolating a lot of us. us. So that's been surprising. I think it's been a little bit disheartening, but I also think it's something that can be overcome with boundaries, with self-understanding, with compassion, and also challenging the paradigms that have been sort of planted in our garden for us of this is what a relationship is supposed to be, and this is how you're supposed to feel within it.
I was going to say, where do you think that this has come from? Because it is true. I feel like each year, actually, it's getting progressively worse. This, like, you must be all these things for me, or
Mm-hmm.
you're nothing to me, or whatever the case is. It kind of seems what it is. Like,
Yeah.
you're wrong if you're not all these things. But no one can be absolutely everything to one person without,
No.
if you are, I mean, you're certainly, it's guaranteed most likely that you're denying yourself what you need.
Yeah. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I think it's dehumanizing. I think when we put each other on a pedestal, we strip away the wholeness of our humanity, of each other's humanity. I think that we create insecure relationships that are based on anxiety, that's based on wanting each other to be something that we can't be. Or even if we are for the briefest moment of time, that maybe we aren't the next day or the next year. It doesn't allow people to change. It doesn't allow people to make mistakes. And I think that we need to I think we need to rehumanize each other. I think we need to set a more realistic view of what human beings are and accept each other for the wholeness of and the very imperfect nature of what it means to be human. And I think that that's a huge step in the combating against sexual shame and shame in general.
Yeah, just kind of embracing humanity, our humanity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Embracing humanity, embracing imperfection, embracing the fact that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to fall short, and that doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us irredeemable. I think we need to change the narrative there too, that we get to make mistakes and we get to learn from them. Everyone does.
Yeah, that, I mean, that concept is, it's just relieving to think about. Like, you're allowed to make mistakes and you're allowed to learn from them, and accepting that we're all going through that process, hopefully can elicit compassion for each other.
Yeah, yeah. I think that this is the danger of how much content we're inundated with every day. This filtered, curated, polished content, which great. It's part of the advance of human society, and I think that it's presenting a lot of information in a way that sets unrealistic standards for people as individuals. I think it sets unrealistic standards for their relationships, and I think that we need to really be questioning and evaluating the information, the media that we're taking in, and filter that against our own very real human experience. Because I think there's a real risk of losing touch with what it means to be a human and to be connected and to have authentic relationships. Um, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think there are a lot of agendas out there. And I think we have to be careful.
When you say content, are you talking about social media, TV, porn, everything? Or is there something in particular you're thinking of?
Everything. Yeah,
Uh,
everything. When we pick up our phone and we kind of mindlessly scroll through the apps, I'm talking about news. I'm talking about social media. I'm talking about porn and movies. There's just so much, and it's so curated now to keep our attention. And I think we need to be aware of the way it's curated and the way it's holding our attention and what it's meant to make us feel and think, because it is designed to change us.
yeah, that is something to really keep in mind. Um, Speaking of these advancements in technology, I'm curious what you think of the role that AI is playing in human connection and human sexuality.
To be honest with you, I don't know what role AI is playing in human sexuality yet. It's happening so fast. Right now, the way that I understand AI is that it takes a lot of information that's out there and it gives you what it thinks that you want, essentially. Which I don't see a lot of inherent danger in that necessarily as it is. I think if we can't distinguish between what is human and what is machine, I think that that has the opportunity to change the way that we relate to other people, and that could hold danger. I can absolutely see where that holds danger. But I think it's happening so quickly right now that we can't even begin to conceptualize what this is going to do to change our everyday lives and how we show up sexually with each other. Um, it's pretty scary, and I think it's something that needs to be treated with a lot of respect. Here's what I will say about AI, though, where I think the real danger is, what we need to watch out for. Propaganda doesn't need to be produced by 1,000 people with computers each and going on online forums and writing out things. Propaganda can be one person in their basement churning out millions of articles per day that align with their specific narrative and motivations. And so here's a great example of where I think it's important to be filtering out what we're reading. Is be aware that what you're consuming may be the agenda of a very few people, and it may be designed to make you think or act in a certain way. And as it pertains to sex, right, as we've already talked about, people have a lot of motivations and a lot of underlying agendas, and I think that we need to be wary of those.
Yeah, that's really well said. And to your point, filtering what you're reading, watching, that type of thing, more than just what it's trying to elicit you to think, sometimes it's like, look at how it's making you feel. Like right
Yes.
now, there's so much that's being put out that is eliciting a lot of anger and rage and fear. And those are really strong emotions that can create a lot of things that aren't always
Mm.
pleasant, are never pleasant, really. But
Violence.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah. It's designed to keep your attention first and foremost, right? Um, we were in the age of a long time, and property was value, land was value, and then it was information. And now, in our lifetimes, we've seen it go to attention.
yeah,
Human attention is the commodity by which the people in power trade,
yeah.
um, and we need to protect that.
If I gave you, I love asking this question, but if
Mhm.
I gave you a microphone and you could give one message, it would broadcast to every person in the world, and you could give them one message about human sexuality that you wish the world got more, or you just don't think they're getting yet, what would that message
Mm. Ah, you are good.
be?
I would tell everyone in the world that as a sexual being, as a human being, but let's focus this on a sexual being for a moment. You are good and you are acceptable. Who you are inherently is normal, it is lovable, it is human, and that is beautiful. Right? There is nothing wrong, there is nothing broken about who you are, and anybody who tells you different has an agenda, and you should reject that agenda. You get to choose always what you do with your body. I think our actions are really important. I think it's important that we operate from a platform, from a foundation of consent fundamentally. But beyond that, you are good.
Beautiful. And I think that that message, if people can really take that in, it undercuts so much shame and guilt. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I hope so. I hope people can start to internalize that message too. And I hope that they can start to act from a place of being good, because that's where the change happens. It's not just hearing it from me, but it's going out. It's acting from that enoughness. It's acting from being acceptable by having these conversations, by learning, by growing, by leaning into discomfort. That's how we accept who we are. That's how we assert who we are in the world.
You mentioned having these conversations, and you also mentioned your friend's organization. I believe you said it was called Squirm.
Squirm, yes.
Squirm, where you're, encouraged basically to have difficult conversations where you may fumble or you may say something the wrong way. Um,
Yes.
I think that's really powerful, and that messaging is really powerful, especially right now, because we live in this age of cancel culture where if you
Hmm.
say one thing the wrong way, you're written off. And it's like
Hmm.
taking away permission to be human and to make mistakes and to learn, like you talked about earlier.
That's it.
It's okay to not do it perfectly.
Yes. And in fact, it's necessary. Um, I think that, gosh, there's so much to be said about cancel culture. I don't want to reject it out of hand, right? I think I heard someone say it really well the other day that it's not cancel culture, it's consequence culture. And I like that. I think it's really important that people are outspoken about the behavior that's acceptable and that's not acceptable. And I think the people that have a lot of visibility are going to just take a lot of the heat. And I think that that's important, frankly. But I also think that we need to supplement that message with acceptance. How do we as a society accept people who are changing, who are putting in the effort? Um, because if we can't start to model that as a society, we certainly can't expect individuals to do that. We have to show people on a macro scale that change is possible and that mistakes are acceptable. Not that they're acceptable, but that it's human. That I think that we don't we're not done forever with the first mistake, because from that perspective, there is no motivation to grow. There's no motivation to do better. We tell people they're bad, they're gonna do bad.
What would you say is your main mission or goal as a sex therapist?
Mm. I want to see people embracing who they are sexually. I want to see people experiencing more pleasure in life. I want to see people accepting themselves and each other. Um, Seeing shame undone within my clients or healed in some way is, I think, the most powerful part of my job. And if there's one thing that I can do for the rest of my career, it will be that. How do I start to create narratives that combat the shame that we are just relentlessly inundated with every day for our entire lives? Can I start to create another voice? Can I start to help people create another narrative around that? I think that's my mission. If I had to pick one, I think that's my mission.
And when you have seen that play out in some of your clients, are there specific ways that you've seen their life change?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think especially when people are willing to start asking for what they want. And there's a lot that goes into that. I think that we have to have enough security, enough emotional safety to be able to be that vulnerable. But once people can experience that safely, assert who they are, set a boundary, express a need, voice a desire or a fantasy, I see them accepting who they are. And when someone else can receive that and say, wow, thank you so much for telling me. Wow, that sounds really hot. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you told me this thing. I have fantasies too. I have permission now to voice more of who I am. It has this cascading effect, even within a dyadic relationship, let alone the community of that person, when people are able to start voicing who they are and confronting those difficult conversations. It is life changing.
Why do you think that we, on an individual level, are so uncomfortable talking about it? Even with, from what I hear, sex therapists always tell me they have couples that are having sex, but not talking about it. And that's creating a lot of issues, even with people that we live with or are married to. There seems to be discomfort with discussing sex. Why do you think that is?
Mm. I think it so often comes back to attachment. People are so protective of their relationships, of their attachments, especially their primary attachment in the world, that if I take up too much space and I say, hey, I really want to try this thing. Well, there's all these scripts running in my head now. What if you don't accept this thing that I said? Am I going to lose you? Am I going to lose the person I love most in this world? What if I say that I don't like something? Are you going to feel hurt? Are you not going to want to connect with me anymore? Am I going to lose love? Am I going to lose belonging? It becomes this survival thing. It becomes fight or flight. That if we can be appeasing, if we can follow the mainstream narrative, then we are in some way protecting ourselves. We are preventing ourselves from being abandoned, rejected, shamed, alone. And that is the narrative that I think that we really need to challenge by having these harder conversations and taking up more space, especially in our sexual lives, is that those things aren't necessarily true. And here's where we get to have boundaries, because if somebody comes into your life who says that it is true, that you are bad for who you are sexually, that you get to choose other people, because our pods of people aren't just 150 anymore. The way that we're wired, it is billions. It's the entire world.
Yeah, I think that's a really inspiring message. And that is one of the benefits of the digital age is that it has connected us to people all over the world that we normally would not ever encounter.
Right. This is where I see hope, is that the technology is allowing for connections that could never have happened otherwise. There's a pot for every lid, and now those pots get to find those lids pretty easily.
Yeah.
And in fact, realize that there's many lids. There's an abundance now, and I think that that's really freeing. And if people let themselves lean into that, I think there's a lot of healing that can happen.
Is there anything about your work, human connection, human sexuality, camming, that we didn't talk about, but you want to share?
I think the main thing that I just want to say with regards to camming, there is, I think, a resurgence of negative rhetoric around sex work. And there are a lot of people who are trying to conflate it and tie it to the issue of human trafficking. And I think that as a society, as a culture, we need to question that. We need to question the agenda behind that conflation. And we need to separate those things, because sex work is real work. I think that sex work represents the liberation of women's bodies, amongst other things. I think it represents sexual liberation. And I think that that's, again, a really important tool in the fight against fascism, which is a very present threat. So when we hear that message that sex work leads to human trafficking, leads to sex work, we need to question it. And I think we need to reject it, because those are separate issues and we need to treat them as such.
Very well said. Thank you.
Yeah.
My final question for you
Oh,
is, with your experience, what do you believe are our next steps, either individually or collectively, in moving forward with a more sexually well society?
I think we need more models of people who are having conversations around sex. For example, right? We've never seen James Bond ask for consent, right? Never once has he asked anybody first, can I kiss you? Can I touch you here? Right? Never once. In the older movies, he just grabs them. It's terrifying. We need models of people in mainstream media having consent conversations, negotiating needs, boundaries, wants, desires. We need to see examples of people having these conversations. setting boundaries in relationships, communicating expectations. Because until that starts to happen, until we start to normalize that, I don't think we're going to reach the masses.
Very well said. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.